I'm talking to Alexis Shotwell about her book, Against Purity, Living Ethically in Compromised Times. And I was wondering if we could start by you telling us what got you started in thinking about purity and purity politics.
I think I started thinking about purity and purity politics partially from being broadly on the left and looking at the way that people who would like the world to be better along any number of different axes or using a bunch of different metrics experience a kind of despair when we realize that it's not actually possible to aim for better without, on some level or using some metric, being a hypocrite. So this could be, I saw a lot of people who were very concerned about global warming and climate change, then feeling like they didn't have any right to say anything about global warming and climate change because they also took a plane home to visit their parents, or they drove their kids to school in a car that used gasoline. Or there were a lot of people who were doing work on one political project about racism, and then they would feel terrible that they weren't, doing the right amount of stuff or the right kind of thing on a different project having to do with racism. Mm-hmm. So it just seemed to me there was quite a lot of, it sounds like it's diminishing it, but sort of like hand-wringing, or a feeling that if you weren't doing everything completely purely, with total perfection, it wasn't worth doing anything. And then simultaneously, I was having a lot of kind of irritating, I would say, discussions with people that I knew who, like me, eat vegan, but who feel that innocence of make you structures of suffering in the food world. So anyway, I started looking around, and just basically everywhere I looked, I felt like there was this really strong and understandable and sad tendency to respond to these impossibly complex solutions as though individual purity was the answer. And sort of starting from there, the book kind of constellated.
Yeah. And you struck me when I was reading about the book before I actually picked it up, and then when I started it, some of the things that you begin by describing, I'm just looking at your intro now, is coral reef killing ocean acidification, human-caused, place devastating elevated sea levels, earth-shaking water poisoning fracking, our toxic lakes and externalities of rare earth minerals production for advanced electronics, and the list goes on. And this is indeed the world we're living in. So, I see where you're coming from. At the same time, where do you get the impetus to start when you, like many of us, are looking at so many issues that it's hard to know where to begin? So how do you begin?
I think that the first place to begin is to recognize that the fact that the problems we face are inescapably complicated and that we are implicated and compromised in things that we reject. The first thing for us to do is just recognize that is the starting place. So too much of the time, I think, when we confront that kind of complexity and complicity, we respond to it by saying, there's just nothing I can do to solve the entire thing, and therefore I am not going to do anything. So for me personally, one of the things that has been really important and really useful is to ask this question that is, if I really take seriously that I can't completely fix this, what can I do? So what are the things that are possible? A key point, I think, for me and for any of us who actually care about the world is to recognize that we can do almost nothing individually, and that the trap of purity politics, the way that it causes us to do nothing, is that we think that we individually need to do everything. So one piece is just starting from a refusal to despair and a refusal to kind of collapse into hopelessness in the face of complexity. Mm-hmm. And the second piece is to adopt a kind of practice of collectively determining and building capacity to work on things that are within our scope, within our reach.
Mm. Now, as you said, we're already in a complex, interactive, interdependent environment, but we still think oftentimes, especially in North America, that we are individuals capable of individual decision making, and so we tend to think of ourselves as the only decision maker in some cases. How do you go from mentally acknowledging that we're interrelated and interdependent to actually acting on it and to building coalitions or collectivities? How do you make that first step once you kind of come to grips with that mentally?
I think that's such a good question. And I think it's a good question partially because so many of us actually have no experience of working in collaboration and coalition with other people to win things. So a lot of North Americans in particular don't have an experience of doing collective political work. And that's sad, you know. So some of the places that I've seen people being able to sort of carry on, right, to keep on working on things over the long term is when they identify a thing that they care about and they ask themselves, what part of this thing that I care about connects to something that is reachable? So a lot of the time people find something within reach that is electoral politics or that is calling politicians. And this is not empty work, right? I know a lot of people right now in my life who have never done a single thing politically, but they're very worried about everything that's happening in the world. And so they have a weekly practice of calling their politicians. And this is a thing that they are starting to get lists of people to call and issues that they care about. Other things that are like that are like, I have a friend in Alaska, Luke Mel, who is a ardent outdoorsman. He does these very long human-powered treks in the wilderness. And at a certain point last summer, he realized that he benefited from all of these public lands that are currently under threat of being opened to mining. Mm-hmm. And he hadn't done very much about them. He walks through them. He loves them. But he's started this very interesting campaign called Stickers for Conservation, where he sends people a sticker if they tell him that they've done something to try to protect the earth. So these are sort of on the side of the spectrum that is like kind of basically individual things that make people feel a little bit connected. Now, the best thing that people can do is long-term, deep-seated, collective solidarity work where there's a strategic goal that is going to address problems that they have identified and that need to be worked on, where people are taking leadership from the people who are most affected by the social relation of oppression that's producing the problem. But that's actually very hard to connect to. So somewhere in the middle, there's going to be space where ordinary people who start to notice, like, look, I'm profoundly worried about global warming, or I'm profoundly worried about migrants being criminalized, or I'm profoundly worried about police brutality. Any of these things mean that people can look and say, among the people I know, or in the place that I live, who is doing something that works toward addressing that? And then can start to just actually plug in and get connected. In the United States, a lot of times there are people who are profoundly concerned about racial violence, violence against Black men in particular, Black women, who are getting involved in surge chapters, Standing United for Racial Justice, white people who are saying, how can I get together with other white people to address this? So I think that's a hard thing to do, and something that when people start connecting gives a kind of antidote to that individualized despair about complexity.
Now, I'm wondering who you picture as a reader in terms of this book in particular, Against Purity, Living Ethically in Compromised Times, because one thing I notice is that you go sort of back and forth between a number of issues that in some ways are very separate, but in other ways, of course, they fit together in terms of the world we're living in. But you look at people from a racial identity, from a ability or disability identity, from queer identities, from environmental protesters and First Nations people. So your book really covers a lot of different groups. Who do you picture reading this, and what kind of idea do you have of your reader?
Yeah, that's a really Useful question. So I wrote this book as I was teaching in a philosophy department and mostly talking to philosophers. And I moved from Sudbury, Ontario, where I was living, to a sociology department where I teach now. And when they interviewed me, I said, look, I have never actually taken a sociology class. Like I can, I've got this interdisciplinary PhD. I study and work with a lot of sociological theorists, and they were like, yes, we're a weird sociology department and we want someone to teach theory. And, so I started writing this book in the context of really being in flux around the discipline that I was writing in relation to, and also feeling a lot of disillusionment with the discipline of philosophy, and the conversations it was possible for me to participate in that space. So if you'd asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have said, I am writing this in conversation with some really, ongoing debates in feminist philosophy, particularly around the intersection of moral theory, ethics, and social and political philosophy. And I kind of think that's still true. Like it's a book where there's a lot of, citation and bringing in and being in conversation with just like ordinary philosophers. Mm-hmm. But I also think that's not true at all. And I'm always very surprised when philosophers tell me that they're reading the book. So, a lot of the people that I picture reading it and that I'm hearing from actually are people who are not academics. And this is, I think, something that we academics often we say, like, oh, I want to write a book that will be available for people who aren't in academia. Mm-hmm. And it turns out there are a lot of people who sort of continue to read theory after they have done their undergrad or they've done a master's degree, and they're out working on things. So picture the book, and it so far seems to be kind of participating in this set of discussions that's happening a lot with people that are in social work and people who are sort of doing, like, they're way past like social justice 101. So they're working in nonprofits or they have a regular job and they're also trying to do something in these other areas. And so some of the most interesting emails that I'm getting are from people that are saying, hi, I'm not an academic, but I've picked up your book, and this is the way that I really see these problems playing out in this area that I work in. So I really should know better who, they say that about books. You need to know who you're in conversation with and who you're offering it to. And I don't feel like I did actually a great job of that in writing the book or thinking about it.
Well, maybe that's good in a way that it allows it to be open to a lot of people because you don't have a specific group in mind.
Yeah. And it's like you said, it's got a genuinely weird and array of things that it's talking about. Like it doesn't, when I was talking about the book before it came out, people would be like, what's it about? And I would be like, well, it's about frogs and also colonialism and, pesticides, but also disability and science fiction. It's just ridiculous, actually.
Yeah, but I think that's the world we live in. Is it's a ridiculous, it's a mess, right? It's a bunch of different things that don't fit nicely into categories, and that's really, on one sense, what the book is about. Does it have a specific goal, your book, or either in writing it or in releasing it for people to read? Do you have something that you want to achieve in particular with this?
Yes, I do. I really want people to have better theoretical tools for resisting the pull of individualism, purism, and the despair that comes from both of those things. Like I really want there to be a way for people to notice when they're feeling immobilized or shut down because things are too big and too complex, and to instead do something else. So I really want the book to be something that gives us a little bit more traction for thinking about a way that we can be in this very complicated world that allows us to carry on. And I think, this part is like more aspirational, but I'm also really interested in what it might look like for us to have better ways to be unpredictable, to not know what we could become. So one of my favorite chapters in the book that I think is also one of the kind of hardest and the most like philosophy of it is this chapter that's about this idea of open normativities, which is holding the possibility that we could aim to be a kind of self and be in a kind of world that doesn't yet exist, but that proliferates more possibilities for more of us to flourish. So for me, that's been the most kind of generative and exciting idea in working with the book. And I continue to feel like it's a thing that I want to offer, this idea that we can't actually predict what things might happen, and we can still work on that. We can still work towards something that doesn't exist yet. And there's joy in that kind of work.
Now, it's funny that you use a number of different theorists or philosophers, but it struck me as interesting that you're using Simone de Beauvoir and the idea of flourishing and opening people's futures, and that basically she talks about, and then you talk about as well, the idea of not closing off the possibilities of people's future, and anybody really that gets their possibilities closed off is going to hurt everybody, in the sense that anyone who can't flourish stops a bigger community from flourishing. Is there anyone who helps you think about how best to sort of flourish or open these possibilities? Is there any thinker or idea that helps you more than others?
Well, Beauvoir, I love the book that I'm engaging with there is this book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, which I think it's sadly underread, under-theorized. And so thinkers that invite us to ask this question without necessarily being didactic, but that ask us, what would it look like to open freedom for others? These thinkers help me, right? Like Beauvoir says, we have to recognize that freedom is where everything that we value actually comes from. And what is freedom? It's this capacity to unfurl our potential, unfurl our possibility in the specific situated context that we actually exist in. And so partially because she doesn't ever say, what the world ought to be like, she sparks my imagination. And I feel like there's something that's really useful there. I also have learned so much from and really love Liddell McWhorter's work. She's someone also who maybe needs to be read more by everyone. Because she's really someone who takes this view from Foucault that we can look at what causes us to be unpredictable to ourselves, that what opens us into something that we hadn't imagined we could be. And she really grounds it. She grounds that idea in practical, kind of actual real life examples, so it's theoretical, but it's completely informed by the kind of material conditions under which we do this work. We actually think about it. And then I'm continually just blown away by this thinker who isn't in his second book isn't in Against Purity. It just came out. Eli Clare, who has a new book called Brilliant Imperfection, which is about disability and the space between care and cure. And actually another newer book, Christina Sharp's. Have you read this book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being?
No, I haven't seen that yet.
It's beautiful. It's helping me so much think about more of this thing that I feel like I didn't do as much in Against Purity as I'm trying to do now, which is looking at the material conditions of history and how they shape the conditions of possibility for the future. So she's working on the wake of the slave ship, the wake of sitting with someone who's died, and the work of becoming woke, so being and that book is another one that's just has felt so generative in terms of that question of how do we take seriously the history that informs our life in a way that we can actually open out of it into something that history doesn't predict.
Yeah. Now, you start off talking about AIDS activists and ACT UP and the history that they they're bringing back now through certain work or through certain documentaries, because the impression, I guess, in some circles is that people suddenly just woke up to AIDS and things were accepted, but that came with a lot of toil and a lot of work by the activists that were there. And so the way that we remember that is going to affect the way that we, in our future endeavors, are going to act in relation to other protest movements or into other activism. I'm curious, do you see the way that this time now that we're in, this complexity, do you see the memories forming already, and do you see it going in a certain direction? Do you see in 20 years from now people thinking about our time here in a certain way?
Yeah, I love that question. Yeah, I mean, I think in some way every time is like that, right? That how we hold the memory of the struggles that people engaged in the past and offered to us, right, in the form of the lives that we have, like that this is always a product of history. And so the question is always, how do we hold that history? How do we honor it? How do we just even know that it happened? What are the politics of memory? So my colleague in this, I'm doing a oral history of AIDS activism in Canada now, and my colleague Gary Kinsman talks about the social organization of forgetting and the resistance of remembering. So, right now, last weekend, there have been these protests by the football players and other athletes who are kneeling during the national anthem. And it's really made me think about the ways that this is a particular intensification and kind of really incredible manifestation of resistance in sport. But it's also part of a long history of resistance in sport that gets a little bit occluded and forgotten, so that people are able to say, like, this is the first time that professional athletes have ever said anything about national politics. This is just not true at all, right? This is like in the 60s, there were, the most famous examples are Tommy Shelby and Muhammad Ali. But there's this kind of actually really long history of athletes calling for attention to issues of national justice. So there's, on the one hand, it's a little sad to say we forget all the time in socially organized ways the amazing things that people did in the past. And on the other hand, there's something that is profoundly hopeful about recognizing that the accretion of history kind of unfolds itself for us, and we can say these things happen again and again. And that's this continual work of people trying to shift things, or attending to how the world could be otherwise than it is, pointing out that things don't have to be like this. And it's hard to know what in the future we will judge to be worthy of memory. But that's part of the work of the present, right? Is trying to create a world that we can say in 20 years or 40 years, let's look back at the work that we did then in such a way that we can lift it up, right? And that we can say our lives now are in virtue of this activity then.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's interesting. You even, among other things, include Buddhism and native religions or native ideas, spirituality in your book. And you kind of separate the book itself into past, present, and future. And I'm wondering what words of advice you would have for people who are struggling with navigating between focusing on the past and reading out these histories and maybe unpacking them, thinking about memory, thinking about the present and our current situation, and then thinking about future possibilities. It can be really difficult to balance that. And I mean, it can be impossible to know exactly how to balance that. But there are these three tenses that we seem to always be concerned with, right? There's the past histories and memories that we need to think about, the current situation that we're dealing with, and the future that we aspire towards or that we worry about. And I know Buddhism, among other things, talks about being in the present. Where do you recommend people, or how do you recommend people navigate between focusing too much or in a way that's not constructive between these three tenses?
Yeah. So the the sort of Indigenous ontologies and Buddhist ontologies bit is mostly thinking about the present. But actually, it's interesting to think about what it would look like to, re-render those in terms of the kind of arc of past, present, and future. I mean, on the one hand, it's just kind of a truism to say the only thing that we can really experience is the present, right? The past is a memory and the future is a dream, and all we ever have is what's happening now. One of the things that I take from, disability theories of interdependence, some of the, I've been really working with a particular stream of Indigenous worldview that comes out of the area that I've been living in, partially in just trying to be a kind of more responsible guest in the place that I am. So mostly Algonquin. I was living in the Tigmishing Anishinaabe territory and then now in Algonquin land places. But thinking about like what it means to actually understand in these very different registers how Indigenous or, particular Indigenous, particular Buddhist, particular disability theorists talk about being connected, being interdependent, being shaped in relation, always in relation with others, has also really helped me think about why, when you say that we're going to attend to the present moment, you have to also understand how the present moment is a product of history. So looking at what brought us to the place that we're at, right? Like what brought us to the present that we're living? That's always a historical question. But when you ask a historical question, part of what you're doing is recognizing that the present is contingent. It didn't happen. There wasn't any kind of like destiny, right? It was a product of choices and of things that people did. And so looking at history in the present, right? Looking at like, how did we come to be here? That can actually be a profoundly hopeful thing, right? It's like people made these choices and therefore we can make other choices in some cases, choices that will predict a future that's different than the past we inherit. So that kind of way of thinking about how do we all come to be connected to each other out of these histories, that's given me a way to think about what it means to say we could make a different future than the history which when we look at it should worry us, right? This isn't a history we want to replicate, actually. But the fact that we can examine how things came to be like this, how did this happen, also gives us some openings for thinking about how things could be otherwise.
And you have this interesting moment in the book that struck me as familiar. When apparently, I guess in your class, when you talk about British and colonial subjects coming to the New World, basically taking over the New World, and how if we were ever to acknowledge this past and accept that that's what happened, then a lot of the students you're teaching in your classes they were afraid that truly acknowledging this and trying to make amends to this would mean getting kicked out of Canada or North America and really having no place to go because they've been here for a few generations or what have you. And so I was curious if you could say a little bit more about that, but also how do you respond to that? So when they hear about these histories that aren't generally front and center, especially in public schools, and they go to university and they hear about these critical histories and they kind of come to an understanding that, yes, colonialism did these things to these people, and despite them not being around, they're still implicated to some degree in this because of their heritage or what have you, and then they get really worried or they get really upset at the implications of this. How do you deal with that, and what does that look like?
Oh yeah, I mean, I used to teach this class called Unsettling Canada. That was, it was a place where we looked at the history and literature around Canadian colonialism, British and French colonialism in what's now Canada, and how that connected to contemporary practices, especially around the Canadian residential school system. And then we looked at histories of Japanese internment, especially in Western Canada, and how that connected to contemporary practices of migration restriction. And a lot of this is exactly as you say, things that students have never learned before. They just don't know what happened. They've never heard it. And I had a lot of students, I still do, I still teach a lot of classes, but that class in particular, really, I had a lot of people come up to me and say, I don't know how to live now that I know these things. And like literally, like, how are you still walking around, Alexis? Like what am I supposed to do with this? And kind of with the quality of like, I would rather not know, I would rather not, I would rather not hold this. And, so on the one hand, the thing that is really, I think, profoundly sad about that is that it shows that for a lot of people, when they learn just a little bit about the history that they've inherited and benefited from, they can't imagine a different way for the world to be. All they can imagine is reversal. So all they can imagine is revenge. Some people respond to this by saying, Indigenous people deserved it. They were weak. So that's there's a definite current of just straight up racist, white supremacist response to learning about the depredations of history. That's just like good. We're seeing a whole bunch of that come up. But for a certain number of people, they look at this history and they say, I am appalled to learn that this is what the country that I consider myself proud of did. And I don't want this to be a way that people are treated. I don't want anyone to be treated this way. And that's an opening for people starting to listen, right? Because in the case of thinking about colonization, I have never talked to an Indigenous person who's doing work on decolonization who says that they want to replicate the horrors that were done to them. I have never heard them say, I want to take white English-speaking kids away from their families by force, make them be in residential schools and speak a language that they don't know and practice a culture that isn't there. To a person, people say, that should never have happened to us. It should never happen to anyone. So reversal is not the goal, and that means that something else can open, right? So being in better relation just means asking a question about, like, if this is the history, what can we do? What can we do to respond? What can we do to make reparation? What can we do to make a different future? So, the main thing that I would say to these students is like, well, the way that I live is by trying to take responsibility for the history I inherit. In my case, my family immigrated to Canada. So I benefit from the immigration policies that produced my family as a kind of desired immigrant. So, what does that mean? What kinds of practices of responsibility can I cultivate? So asking those kinds of questions can be very generous and generative, and certainly opens a lot more space than just feeling bad.
Yeah. Well, and another thing that I've noticed myself, so living in Georgia, I'll meet people in town or something and have conversations, and basically it goes something like this, where I'll talk about a historical moment or a contemporary moment that is really problematic and that maybe Americans or America as a country is involved in, easily racism or xenophobia or something that is on my mind or something. And people will effectively say, I'm a good Christian, and I'm not racist, and therefore, I have nothing to do with this. And I kind of wonder, and I kind of go back and forth between thinking, so in this case, it's not so much myself that's involved in this purity politics, but it's the person I'm talking to is very, very influenced, although they wouldn't say it like that, I don't think, but by a purity standpoint where they are being pure, they're good people, and so the idea that they could be part of something, even just by virtue of their citizenship of something that's not good, just doesn't seem to register, and so it doesn't come up as a subject. Now, you having written this book, I'm sure that a lot of people who are wanting to engage in these kinds of discussions are going to read your book, and that's to be expected. What about the people that wouldn't pick up your book and that wouldn't consider purity politics any kind of issue? Do you think those who are concerned ought to engage in those kinds of dialogues, or should we? What advice do you have for discussing or having debates with people who seem to be engaging with that kind of stuff, but but don't necessarily think of it in that sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've written a lot in other work, not so much on this book, about white shame and the experience of feeling ashamed of being the recipient of the benefits of whiteness. And one of the things when I have difficult conversations with people, they say, what you're saying is that you think I should go out and shame my family or the person who I meet on the street. And I don't actually think that that's politically very useful, right? To be like, yeah, you're wrong about that, you know? Mm-hmm. So again, this comes back to the kind of really practical, sort of tactical question of what's the purpose of the conversation? You know, what's it going to do? Who's it for? So some of the time having those sort of general conversations, like when someone says, I'm a good Christian, I'm not involved with any of that, you know, there's an opening there to say, I think that our responsibility as good exemplars of whatever faith we participate in is to actively ask, how does my church participate in or resist, you know, Islamophobia, right? Or what does it mean to be welcoming the stranger? So what's the active form of being a good Christian? So if someone doesn't feel complicit, right, if they don't feel that there is anything for them to work on, the openings are going to be different, right? They're going to be saying, if someone else is also a Christian, you know, I have these friends who are working with the United Universalists to look at what actively resisting racial oppression really looks like. And these are tremendously generative conversations because they're allowing people of faith to have really to interrogate and look at themselves and ask what their faith means as a practice, right? Not as a state. So that's very interesting to me, you know. But in general, I think like my prescriptive is that when people talk to me and they talk about feeling helpless and implicated and like there's nothing they can do, I talk to them about how, yeah, that's a really hard feeling, that you're implicated and you're a hypocrite. And we talk about what it means to just start from there instead of thinking that that's a reason to stop. But, you know, when people are not experiencing that or they feel like they're fine, you know, I mostly feel like, what's the point of fighting with them about that? You know, mm-hmm. Like I might invite them to work on something with me that I care about. But I increasingly have this like feeling that we just need different like arguing with people pretty much never helps anything that we're actually trying to accomplish. Right.
Yeah.
But talking to them, inviting them to work on things with us, that sometimes does.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's part of the benefit of looking at it from this perspective, right? Is that I think a lot of the things in the media, which is what I study, is really based on contrast and one side versus another side, because that's the most interesting kind of fight you can have usually in these kinds of debates and these kinds of shows. But it changes the game significantly to see both sides as openly accepting or reflecting the hypocritical side that we have to deal with and accept and talk about. That completely changes the way that things are discussed. I'm curious, actually, you open the book with an image of you coming back, if I recall correctly, from a conference on the Anthropocene, talking about, among other things, I would suppose, humans' contribution to carbon release in the atmosphere and global warming and stuff like that. And you're on a plane that is releasing tons of pollution into the environment, and you're debating whether you should get a ginger ale because you don't want to waste a plastic cup.
Yes, this literally happens to me every time I fly.
And well, it's funny because I was talking to my partner about this the other day, and we were having the same kind of conversation, thinking basically that we're good people. We recycle and we try to compost and we do all these things, but then we've flown around the world pretty much in the last few years when you put it all together. And so, I mean, we're definitely not helping the environment like we think we are. And it's a strange situation. And I wonder, why do you think that is, that it's so easy to look at a plastic cup and worry about ourselves while we're on a plane that's literally dumping tons of carbon into the atmosphere?
Yeah, I mean, well, part of this is the history of discourses around responsibilizing individuals about things like recycling and energy usage. So there's this journal that I love, Discard Studies, and a project that Max Lebriax in Newfoundland has been working on about waste. And there's a whole super interesting field about critical studies of waste. So, one of the accomplishments of the turn in the 80s toward neoliberalism was this idea that individuals are responsible for systematic problems. And this is a big part of purity politics, right? That when we look around and we're like, oh, I have these friends who are like, I'm just trying to keep my kid safe. And I've read about the dangers of pesticides. So I just try to at least feed my kid organic food. And they're like, I know that this does nothing to combat the workers who are being poisoned by pesticides and all the other things, but I'm just trying to manage the thing I can manage, that I feel I have responsibility for. So I think part of it is like, there's all these things that we can't personally solve. So the fact that the aviation industry could be much, 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 much more efficient, and it's not because of complicated things about the price of oil and also engine design, right? Like people who study infrastructure look at like, why have combustion engines changed so little in so long? There's also like these super interesting histories in North America, which is mostly where I fly and possibly mostly where you fly. Mm-hmm. It's like there are specific moments where the kinds of high-speed trains that exist in many other parts of the world didn't happen here because of the complex intertwining of the automobile industry with the military-industrial complex and its commitment to roads that could mobilize tanks. So, when we really look, we're like, well, I can't solve the military-industrial complex and its commitment to roads that can move tanks. And I would take a train. A lot of the trips I go on, I would take a high-speed train if I could, mm-hmm. or trains cost the same amount as planes. So because we look at that and we're like, I can't solve that, we worry about the plastic cup, and the ginger ale. And so really, a big part of, I think, the orientation is to say, okay, what does it look like to recognize that our individual choices don't matter a lot, and that for a lot of these things, the people who need to be polluting less and changing their practices are these mega industry players. And the only way that those people change is when they're forced to, right? By the political economy shifting or by regulation changing. But I feel like there is something that matters individually and personally about, you and your partner recycling what you can, composting what you can, about me even like holding in ethical regard the plastic cup. And something there feels important to me about being an individual who recognizes that we cannot individually solve something, but we still turn our attention toward that question. Like this for me is part of the ethic of being in relation and of practicing what in the book I'm calling distributed ethicality. So doing what we can from where we are, building our capacity to do more, and refusing to be convinced that it's hopeless for us to do anything if we can't solve everything. So there's something where even though it doesn't actually, it doesn't matter in terms of the scale of like pollution from the airplane, the other petrochemical that produced the plastic cup is just so minuscule. But we're minuscule, we're tiny individuals. And so our turning our attention and registering that we care, I feel like there is something that's ethically important about that. In the same way that there's something that matters about being oriented toward the world in terms of, showing up in our life with some quality of attention and presence, saying hello to people, being, there's something that matters about being present. So that's the other kind of existentialist ethic that I take from Beauvoir, that the only scale we have to work with really is the scale that we're at. And And that scale includes having an understanding of the vastness of the context that we're situated in relation to, the hopelessness of fundamentally changing it, and still sort of having the will to try. So I think it's still useful to worry about composting and recycling, even when we know that it's not actually going to solve it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think, Against Purity and what you've said today, I think give people a lot to think about. And I think these ideas capture a really important thing that a lot of people don't really know how to put in words. And I think you've done a great job doing it in this book. And I just want to thank you for talking to me today.
Oh, thank you so much for talking to me, and really wonderful to have these kinds of questions and the opportunity to talk about these things. So thank you.